All right, guys, we're moving on to imperialism, and this is taking place in the same time of a lot of the things we've been covering in the age of realpolitik and the age of mass politics. And so, even though this is coming after it, don't think that it's happening after. This is all kind of happening at the same time. Okay, and then we talked about during that time there are some that favored imperialism, right? Jingoism, and those are trying to push a strong foreign policy and expansion of their empire. But those that were against that, and they would voice their opinions in politics as too, and they were anti-imperialists. Okay, so I'm going to start off and putting up these kind of FRQ prompts. Um, they're not full-on FRQ prompts, but they are good essay prompts for you just to think about. In looking at these three things, I want you guys to know that what you need to take out of this lecture is essentially three main ideas. Okay, what's the difference between old imperialism versus new imperialism, or the causes and motives of imperialism, and what types of methods did the European nations use in order to accomplish their goals, okay, and set up colonies. So, first one, let's talk about old imperialism. This happened in the 16th to 18th centuries. We went over this, right? The age of exploration. European powers didn't actually acquire and take hold of the territory, but they really started to establish what we call trading stations or trading posts. And we talked about how Africa was a place where the slave trade and the triangle trade was very popular, and Portugal was the first to establish trading posts along the west coast, right? So from Portugal, they left and went down the west coast of Africa. Eventually, they got to India and Indonesia, and then they are also looking to the spice trade. Okay, and from that, you also have the Netherlands, and the Netherlands were part of the Dutch East India Company. They went to talked about Java, right, Indonesia, and also Ceylon, which is current day Sri Lanka. So, for the most part, European nations during the old imperialism stage, they would respect and cooperate with the local rulers, not imposing a lot of their laws and their methodology and their ideas on them. So places like India, China, Japan, Indonesia, where they had successful trading posts, they were only really working with the local merchants and traders, not trying to take control of their government. The New World is an exception, as you can see here. The New World was another place that the age of exploration is where the Europeans were able to reach. Spain was the country to establish its crazy empire in Central and South America, and then they took a lot of different portions of North America as well. So what happens in the New World? Well, in the New World, the natives would be subject to the Europeans, and from that point on, there's a huge dominance, right? Portugal would use Brazil as kind of a sugar colony, and a lot of slaves would be imported from Africa into working a lot of these sugar fields, and also we talked about how in the Spanish Empire for the gold and silver mines, right? Mining, all of those things for their wealth. England also would set up its own colonies, and even in the Caribbean, they would have their own sugar colonies. France also would take parts of Canada, right? And at that point, they would actually reside there, right? They'd have settlements there, and we'll talk about the difference between, right, the settlements and just having trade relations, economic relations. Okay, so by the early 19th century, the kingdoms, okay, the kingdoms that were part of old imperialism have now become nation states, right? So we talked about how with the unification of Italy and Germany, right, with England and its evolution of reform, right, and all these different countries that have been going through a lot of political struggles, ups and downs, and changes. We're at the point where we see that the European nations are now nation states, right? We went from the modern state now to the nation state. So that reminds me, I should probably give more definition upon what's the difference between a modern state and a nation state. But the main point is that there's nationalism, there's that pride and love for your country, and so European powers are trying to figure out how they can expand territory, expand their borders. But the thing is, the continent Europe's not really growing, so then they look outward. Okay, this is kind of a sub factor. It's important to know why many Europeans would leave Europe and go to different places, and how this actually took place at the same time as the age of new imperialism. So by 1815, we're going to see for about a century, from 1815 to 1932, 60 million Europeans are going to leave Europe and relocate somewhere else. Countries like Great Britain, Ireland, Italy, and Germany are going to be in this first wave. That's what I learned in AP Human Geography. They're part of the first wave of major European migration, looking for a greater opportunity in usually it's the United States, but also other places like South America, Australia, New Zealand, and even other North Canada. Okay, so by going there, okay. These are the countries with the largest number of immigrants. Immigrants are those who are leaving, right? Immigrants are those who are coming in. And most of them are from poor and rural areas. They do need to have a little bit of money, some capital to leave, though, to be able to at least take a chance, buy a ticket. Later on, the reason why for some of these places is because, like for example, Ireland went through its potato famine, right, and that's going to be a push factor of why many people within a country are going to be leaving, because they shouldn't stay there because there's famine, right? And then there's also pull factors, right? So this is not that really important for AP Euro, but it's just interesting knowing why do people move, okay? All right, Jews. Heard about Jews with anti-Semitism. Many Jews would relocate to the United States because there's persecution that's going on in Europe. And in the U.S., were they completely free of Jew haters? No, but they were actually a little bit more open than a lot of the closed countries, especially in Eastern Europe. Okay, so the main point is that how would this really matter? Well, European migration is going to impact and really further Western expansion. Okay, and as they are going into different lands, this is where Europe is going to be branching out and going to different places. Okay, so if we talk about what's new imperialism is like, well, if we talk about the two major areas, right, we're going to cover in the next lectures Africa and Asia. Asia, the Europeans were there for a long time, ever since old imperialism, and that would actually evolve slowly. In some places, they're going to have heavy colonialization. In other places, they're not going to really have setting up colonies in Asia. But in Africa, it's around 1880s is where it's kind of the climax of everything. To see kind of the jump of how the 19th century really was a time where imperialism was a huge priority in every nation state in Europe, or the major ones at least. By 1800, we're seeing that 7% of the world's territory, okay, is controlled by Europeans, European countries. But by 1914, they're going to control 84%. Okay, 84% is pretty much the entire world. Okay, there's some places, 16%. That's not much left. I don't know if they're even counting, right, Greenland and Antarctica, which is full of ice. I don't know. Okay, the main number one empire, right? That's going to be the British Empire. They are going to control 25% of the world's population by 1900. 25%. Okay, a quarter of the people are under British rule, and this is going to also include 20% of the world's territory. And if you guys have heard before, for the British Empire, there's that coined term, the empire where the sun never sets. And the reason why is because they have territory pretty much in every single time zone. So if it's night in one territory, it's pretty much daytime on the other side of the world. And so the empire is always moving, always growing over time. Okay, all right, so something to know is that a factor which we'll get into is that through the Industrial Revolution and industrializing their country, better technology, right, we're going to see that through sea transportation and land transportation like the railroad, okay, Europeans are able to travel the world and go from different types of colonies throughout the British Empire, and they are accessing lands that are more inland. They're not just going to the coastal cities like it was in the age of exploration, but now they're going inwards because they can build tens of thousands of miles of railroad. Okay, so places like Australia, Canada, India, and colonies in Africa, even Asia and the Caribbean, the British Empire is there. It has its dominance there. Okay, sorry. All right. So as Europeans are going to places like Africa and Asia, they're really using military force as a means to control local governments. And so what do they really do? Well, we're getting to the causes and motives of what they do once they actually take control of it. But for the most part, one thing we need to know is new imperialism is really a self-centered agenda for European nation states. Okay, it's really based upon what they can gain. They're going to explain that they want to work with the local natives there and help develop their countries, but really it's for selfish gain and a lot of control, right, and imposing. I'll explain this, but as a reminder, as I'm putting in here now, we're going to see, if you remember that little that tree diagram that I gave you guys in the beginning of the year, right? We're at that time where they're establishing even more controlling colonies, but eventually after, okay, into the 20th century, okay, Europe's going to go through decolonization. Okay, so we can kind of see what's happening in the future, and this is kind of the beginnings of it. Okay, all right, that's good. Okay, so the causes and motives. This is kind of like the main points here. Okay, this is something that you definitely have read in textbook, but you should have learned in world history and should remember this. It's really important. Okay, old imperialism. The three motives we talked about before were the three G's, right? So the first one is God, glory, and God, glory, gold. Okay, God, glory, gold. So religious, political, social, and economic. Okay. In my class, when I teach world history, I introduce empire, like building an empire, just an ends in M and M's in N. And okay, so empire is kind of like the acronym that I use instead of the three G's. Three G's is for old. Empire is for the new imperialism. All right, so the first one is going to be economic. Okay, so for economic motive of a European country, why would they want to colonize or practice imperialism in Africa? Well, they're looking specifically for new markets, which means that new customers to buy their goods in the Industrial Revolution because they have a surplus of goods. They have more things that they can sell, and so they're looking for more customers that would buy them. The problem is that the natives that live in Africa and Asia, were actually too poor to buy these European goods. And so, for example, Germany, only 1% of its total trade was with its colonies. Okay, France would actually import more goods from its colonies than actually would sell and export to them. It makes sense. It's not just in these two countries. It's because they don't have that type of standard of living. They don't have that cash flow. Okay, examples also instead of obtaining obtaining new markets to sell things, they're also going to find that in these specific areas in Africa and in Asia, there are a lot of raw materials and natural resources that are very valuable that they cannot find in abundance in Europe. Okay, so ivory and rubber in the Congo, diamonds in South Africa. You have cocoa and tea in countries like that. Okay, cotton in India, spice in Indonesia. Right, so these places, they have these exotic raw materials, natural resources that they want to get their hands on. Okay, and nationalism. Between N, P, I, okay, they're kind of all tied together. We talked about how during the age of mass politics, governments are using nationalism as a way to kind of mask the social conflicts that are going on. And so because there are those that support their country's dominance, right? They have a lot of national pride and say, oh, look how powerful our empire is. Look how powerful Great Britain is. And so their military and their foreign policy is going to work together in order to set up these military bases in order to maintain closer control, right? And because of this, right, it's going to lead into the political tensions between a lot of the European states because there's competition to grab as much land as possible in these continents, Africa and Asia, and eventually they can, build a stronger empire. And so we have basically the haves, which is the British Empire, France, right? They have been kind of on the rise economically. And then you have the countries that have just unified, Germany, Italy, they just unified in the 19th century. And so they're kind of new. And so they have been late in the game in terms of trying to obtain land. And they're trying to play catch up. Okay. All right. Ideological. Okay, so some of the ideas that we said, ideologies of the 19th century is nationalism. Okay, but also we talked about how there was social Darwinism coming on with Herbert Spencer. Right, he supported it and he said the survival of the fittest. This would justify and explain why are Europeans dominating Africans? Why are Europeans in Asia and taking over control? Is because it makes sense. It's rational, right? We're stronger, you're weaker. This is what really happens. Okay, and so as the educated, as the developed, as the industrialized, as the wealthy, we are looking to help you and develop your country, and so they can justify their superiority towards them and look on the native people as uncivilized and savages. Okay, which brings up the white man's burden. Okay, I don't have this as a bullet point that I wrote in, but you need to write this down. White man's burden is a very racist idea at that time, and saying that the Westerners, the Europeans, are obligated to help civilize these uncivilized people, these savages, because they don't know how to live, right? And so it's the white man's burden to help them, and we should improve their lives. Okay, so the phrase was coined by a poet named Rudyard Kipling. You guys probably read about him in your textbook. Okay, and we'll talk about the actual poem later on. We'll break that down. But we're just getting through this lecture. Okay, so yes, and we talked about how also the idea of nationalism is going to mask over the class struggles that are going on in places like Germany and Russia. Middle class, working class, splitting, but at the same time, right, they're trying to bring together national unity, and they use nationalism and imperialism as one of those things. Okay, moving on to religious. We have missionaries because there's a religious revival that happens in the mid 1800s. The middle class is going to begin to start leading these missionary movements by spreading their faith, Christianity, to Africa and Asia. They found out that if they go to places like North Africa and Asia, they're actually very closed off. Because in North Africa you have the Muslim empire that was coming from back in the 700s, right? Talking about how they went through North Africa, going into Spain, right? And then also in Asia, they have Buddhism, Hinduism, very closed off, not very open. But sub-Saharan Africa, right? So Sahara is kind of like in the middle portion of Africa, right? What is below that, okay, Central and Southern Africa, they're actually more open to Christianity. Okay, and then we have two guys. One is Dr. David Livingstone. You probably heard of him in your textbook in world history class, right? He's a Scottish doctor that's a missionary trying to do religious work, humanitarian work, and he goes to the Congo, right? And then eventually he's gone for a long time trying to recruit and get people to go to the Congo, get in this detail. And then eventually a guy named Henry Stanley will go to try to find him because he's a reporter, and they eventually find him, and Stanley will find him in the middle of Africa. Okay, all right, and the last one is exploratory. This one kind of ties on with political and knowing that as they expand and grab more land, they're finding new things and bringing more power and glory to their own country. Okay, all right, so very clearly I have listed out what I guess the pattern is for a lot of these European nation states. So the European country has these causes and motives for imperialism. So what do? Well, they begin to then look to set up colonies. Okay, now are they obligated to? No. There's three types of imperialism. There's political, economic, and social cultural. As we can imagine, political is they trying to control a local area, right? They may not have a colony, but they just want to control the local area with the local government, right? Economic is basically can they gain those new markets and gain those raw materials and natural resources without actually controlling the government? Well, that happens in some cases too. We'll talk about how China is one of those cases. Social cultural. This is the ideological and religious factor, right? How can we civilize them? How can we teach them and improve their lives and develop their country, right? So the thing is, European countries can choose any of these three without actually setting up a colony, but what is happening is that most of the time, because there's all these causes that are mixed together, they end up setting up a colony, right? And it fits all three of these things into the colony. And there's two types of colonies. There's the tropical dependencies, and there's the settlement colonies, okay? The tropical dependencies, the difference between them is that it's not very appealing to a lot of European settlers to actually live there for long term. And the main goal of a tropical dependency is that they're trying to gain just those natural resources, and it's more of an economic imperialism. The ratio between the European people living there and the native people living there is that there's a small European population and a large native population, and they're kind of just controlling them. And some of the problems that they're going to see is that they have to really manage the native people with their different cultures and language. There's some uprisings of the natives. They're trying to kick them out and get rid of the European imperialists. And also, just trying to set up a local government is very difficult. And so places like Africa, Asia, and South Pacific is where we're going to see tropical dependencies. But then there's also settlement colonies, right? So we kind of talked about this before. These are more appealing for Europeans to go to. They see it as long-term, as they can live there and relocate there. There's a dual goal. One is to definitely exploit the natural resources, but also they want to set up settlements and eventually develop a whole political system as a colony there. The ratio is flipped, right? You have large European population and maybe like a small to equal native population. And so the problems is that there's going to have fewer conflicts because there's more other Europeans that support that local government there. But the similar problems, okay, are still going to happen where people are going to feel resentful towards those who are colonizing them. All right, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, Hawaii, South Africa. These are the places for settlement colonies. All right. We'll jump in. Remind me about the tree thing. Yeah. There's something else too. We'll get to it. White man's burden. Two things. Remind me about that.